Close-Up America is produced by the Close-Up Foundation and funded in part by grants from the DuPont Company and RJR Nabisco Incorporated.
Hello, I'm John Molesky. I'd like to welcome you to Close-Up America. This is the season premiere of our new season. Thanks for joining us. This is Close-Up's 10th year with C-SPAN, and we're glad to be coming to you. Tonight we're going to be discussing the effects of Glasnost and Perestroika, the Gorbachev policies on the Eastern Bloc. As you know, the world is changing, and that's not a news flash, but it is changing very rapidly, particularly in the countries of Poland and Hungary. We're going to talk about those situations and others as the hour progresses. Let me introduce you to our guests. Joining us in C-SPAN's Washington studio is Frank Gaffney, Director of the Center for Security Policy, and Michael Parenti, political scientist and author of the book The Sword and the Dollar. Gentlemen, welcome to Close-Up America. We're going to be taking questions from a group of high school students participating in a day-long Close-Up local program taking a look at these issues. They are coming to us from Fairfield High School in Fairfield, California. We'll be coming to your questions in just a moment. Let's begin here. Mr. Gaffney, how many of the reforms that we see taking place do you see as substantive, real, long-term changes, or do you view it somewhat cynically, as some do, and say that a lot of it is public relations on the part of Gorbachev and the Soviet Union?
Well, I tend to believe that the changes that we're seeing fall into a sort of mixed bag. Some are real, some are unquestionably, astonishingly different from the way things used to be in the Soviet Union. But by the same token, very few of them, if indeed any of them, have materially affected the character of the Soviet system itself, its political system, its economic system, and particularly its military system. It's the absence of those fundamental structural changes that I find quite worrisome.
Mr. Parenti, same question, similar question. How do you view the changes?
I think there are tremendous fundamental changes. Certainly in the military system, the Soviets for years have been trying to keep up with the U.S. military escalation, and every time they played catch-up with us, we used that as proof to escalate even further, and now Gorbachev is unilaterally dropping out of that arms race and unilaterally initiating cuts and asking the U.S. to do the same, and fundamental ones and massive ones, too. They've rewritten their entire constitution, set up a presidential system. They've brought in opposition voices, opposition candidates with opposition views, including ones who are against the communist, the socialist system, or against socialism, advocates of capitalism. We don't get that in our own country. I mean, you can't get socialists or advocates of socialism in the mainstream of American politics. I mean, they wouldn't be given that kind of access, not a regular access, to our major media and whatever else. So I think there are very remarkable changes all through the system. In fact, if you wanted to see a lack of change, I'd say you'd find it in the West. There hasn't been a sufficient responsiveness to that by Mr. Bush, who just seems to be sitting back and saying, as our friend here is saying, well, some things are changing, but we're just going to sit here and wait, instead of responding and encouraging those changes.
Other than in the Soviet Union itself, perhaps the most dramatic changes, at least recently, have taken place in Hungary and in Poland. Why those two countries so ripe for change, and why haven't some of the other Eastern Bloc countries taken the opportunity to make changes, as Gorbachev has allowed?
Well, I can speak a little better on Poland than on Hungary. Poland was a case of colossal mismanagement. In the early 70s, the Communist Party decided it was going to increase its capital investment, its fundamental industrial capacity, and increase consumer goods, and do both of those at the same time. And the way it was going to do that was by borrowing from the West. And then one day the chickens came home to roost, and they found themselves with this huge, colossal debt. And they turned to the Polish working class and said, "We goofed, and you're going to have to take cuts in wages and buying power, so we can start paying off some of this debt." And that's what caused much of the disruption, plus corruption, plus large sectors of the Polish population have never really wanted socialism or Marxism. They've accepted the benefits of no unemployment and guaranteed right to a job and health insurance and free education, those things, but they've never really liked that system, and they have a longing for the Western ways, and they will be getting the Western ways now. Price controls have been lifted. There's a incredible inflation in Poland today, and you'll be seeing strikes, and you'll be seeing unemployment, and you'll also be seeing a tremendous increase in consumer productivity too, probably. I mean, as capitalism goes into Hungary and Poland, it will reward the winners very handsomely, and it will punish the losers and punish many other people who aren't losers.
So Gaffney, do you see some type of reverse domino effect where perhaps these Eastern Bloc countries will line up behind Poland and Hungary and institute the types of changes that we see happening there?
Well, I think what we are seeing in Poland and Hungary, and the reason that we're seeing it as vividly as we are in those two countries, is the utter bankruptcy of the communist system. Inevitably, as more and more countries are forced to come to grips with that reality, we will, I think, see similar irresistible pressure for change. I'm struck that we're not seeing it to speak of thus far in East Germany, hence the flow of people out of that country through Hungary to the West. That's no accident. The reason we are not seeing fundamental structural changes beginning to take place in those countries, even I think as we're not seeing it yet in the Soviet Union, is because that East German economy is propped up by West German investments and loans and other subsidies, many of which are very difficult to monitor given the Germans' view that they're all one country and such flows between its two halves are not a matter for reporting to external authorities. But where we do see the West bailing out these communist governments, and I think that's the serious danger we face now, as people argue that we should respond to what remain, I argue, half measures by Gorbachev, by making untied loans, by providing him very sophisticated technology, some of which is directly relevant to military applications, and otherwise helping to subsidize his government, is that we will see the pressure for fundamental change and the ability of that country to move towards a genuinely different society and one that poses less of a threat to us attenuated.
We're going to get our students involved in the conversation right now. Gentlemen, when we go out to Fairfield, I want to remind our students, please tell us your name and where you're from. Let's take our first question. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Donna.
Hi, Donna.
And this is for either one of you. Which of the Eastern Bloc countries, in your opinion, will respond and react more readily within the next year to Glasnost and Perestroika?
Along the lines of what we were talking about, what would your predictions be on where the most upheaval will take place?
Well, Poland already has, I think, shown a wide open political situation. I don't know. How you want to make a prediction?
Well, I tend to think that where we're going to see the most dramatic change in the next year is probably in one of the countries that has seen very little change so far. It may well be East Germany. Right now they're in the midst of a fundamental succession crisis. By all accounts, the present head of the state, Honecker, who has been one of the most Stalinist leaders of the Soviet Empire since he came to power, is on probably his deathbed. If he fails to recover, it's very unclear who will succeed him, and my guess is that you will see more of the same kind of demands on the part of East Germans for change in that country, whether it's in response to Perestroika and Glasnost or whether it's simply in response to the fundamental loathing that most East Europeans feel towards the communist system that's been imposed upon them. It's hard to say, but I think you will see fundamental changes taking place there.
I don't know about most. I don't know where our associate gets his statistics from, but there were 3 million East Germans who traveled to West Germany and West Berlin this past year, and almost all of them came back. Of the 60,000 who went to Hungary, a good chunk, definitely over, what, 12 or 13,000 defected, but the rest, the majority, went back. And I think the majority of East Germans really want to see, of course, changes. They want to see changes in the bureaucracy. They want to see changes in the leadership. This guy's 78 years old and on his deathbed, and he still can't let go of power. They want to see an opening and more democracy. And what's happening, I think, in these countries is a movement from siege, siege psychology, which was what revolutionary socialism is, surrounded, attacked, invaded by foreigners, worried about espionage, worried about subversion, fighting back, building discipline, building organizations, all under the leadership of the Communist Party to make these economic changes, to bring these public health and human service programs, by the way, some of which we still don't have in our own country for our poor and such. And what you got now is large sectors of the population wanting to move from from siege socialism to consumer socialism and have more democracy. And what many of the leaders have even found out is the trouble with this kind of very tight one-party rule is you don't process information, you don't get feedback, you don't have accountability, you don't have what we call in public administration redundancy, where you can have systems of checks on each other, checks and balances. And so the system was, in fact, suffering from a good deal of unaccountability, of corruption, of production plans, not only not being fulfilled, but getting covered up, getting lied about, people stealing materials and selling it on the black market and that kind of thing. So the attempts now are really, I don't think they're really all just hell-bent on discarding socialism. This image of a totalitarian tyranny that's been imposed on them. We've been hearing that for about 30 years, 40 years, about this immutable, monolithic, unchangeable, incorrigible totalitarian system. And in fact, look what's happening. Look at the remarkable changes, openings that are going on. I don't see that kind of thing happening in fascist countries except with enormous amounts of struggle and certainly with no help from the U.S. So I'd love to see that same kind of thing happen in Honduras and Guatemala and in a number of other countries, Indonesia, Paraguay, and places like that.
But John, I think the bottom line is that where the issue has been put to people, and even where it has been put under highly stilted circumstances, in which people have a very difficult time fully expressing their views, it's clear that all of this marvelous political theory about how it's in their own interest to be suppressed and how this tyrannical regime that denies them fundamental human rights and liberties is really not all that bad and it's worth putting up with for a good healthcare system is rubbish. And
I never said that.
People don't want socialism. People don't want totalitarian communism, and where they're getting any chance to get rid of it, they're doing so. And I think if you look at Poland, which you suggest you are most familiar with, I think we're starting to see indications that as far as they think they can get away with moving, they're going to move. And if they could get away with the full 9 yards in Latvia and elsewhere in the Baltics, in Moldavia and elsewhere in the Soviet Union, in Hungary and Poland and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, people will get rid of the kind of system that you've sung the praises of.
No, I haven't sung the praises of that, of the suppressive aspects. I've sung the praises of the economic democracy, and I'm saying there's got to be more political democracy and better economic performance. But your goal also is capitalism. You're like the Solidarity representatives I met who lied to me years ago when I said, well, are you still going to keep your social welfare programs? Are you still going to keep your socialism? Oh, yes, yes. It's not socialism we're going to hurt. We're going after the communism, and we weren't going for political democracy. They're not interested in political democracy now. It turns out they're interested in private markets and private corporations coming in, and that's what George Bush is interested in. George Bush has given no aid to Poland. He hasn't given a penny. The money he has offered is not to the Polish people. He's offering it to private entrepreneurs and private companies to build up private business. And he would give billions if he thought that infrastructure could take that for private business. And that's why he's given so little.
I would argue that's the only way he's going to solve the fundamental Polish problem. It's not by throwing more money at the socialist system.
You think capitalism will solve it? You'll watch. You'll see it. They'll get their capitalism all right. They're going to get it right up the kazoo.
But you can't deny the fact that the system that's now in place has not supplied basic goods to the people.
I think it has enormous problems, but it has. I talked to someone from West Germany who talked to friends of hers came from East Germany, and they marveled over the selection of goods and whatever else, and they said, this is wonderful, we don't have this in our country. Look at your stores, oh, 7 different kinds of jeans and this and that and these shirts, oh, this is wonderful. And then they went to her home, and she said, I don't know why, it never happened before. A beggar came to my door begging for food. And they said, what is this? She said, in our neighborhood, that usually doesn't happen. And they were horrified at the idea of someone begging for food. So it's true they don't have that glorious consumer society that we have, but they also don't have beggars in the street. They also don't have people sleeping on gratings. They also don't have 2 million homeless, the way that we, the richest country in the world, has. So as I said, capitalism rewards the winners very well, but it's pretty harsh on the losers, and it's harsh on a lot of other people who have to struggle and make ends meet. And in countries where it's most successful in the capital accumulation process, like Central America, Latin America, where your capital investment and value added is not 50%, but 200 and 300% because working conditions are so bad you can exploit labor, capitalism is even harsher and worse. So I would say capitalism's successes are in many ways, for the people at the bottom, worse than socialism's failures in that sense. Which doesn't mean you can't improve. There isn't room for plenty of struggle and plenty of improvement in that country, in those countries also, in socialist countries.
I suspect we could have some disagreement between both of you on this for quite a while.
Ask the high school students.
Let's go back to Fairfield, California for another question. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Monica, and this question is generally directed to both gentlemen. With the implementation of the Glasnost policy, how will this affect the production of food, clothing, and necessary goods for the Soviet people, and will it allow a more open market?
Well, again, I think it depends very much on what you think perestroika is trying to do. My own assessment of it is, to the extent that it is, in fact, meaning to make more efficient the existing centrally planned system, to provide at the margins somewhat greater latitude to individuals to be entrepreneurial, but basically to retain in the state the ultimate decision-making power of where resources go and who gets to use them for what ends, you're not going to see the fundamental problems that are crippling that society resolved. And, you know, to talk about beggars and homeless in the streets, first of all, I honestly believe, and I think we've seen in the era of Glasnost greater evidence of this than ever before, that there are people who aren't getting enough to eat. There are people who are suffering and who are living in absolutely terrible conditions throughout the Soviet bloc, as there are elsewhere. The real problem is just about everybody else is also living under the Soviet system under very, very grim circumstances. And again, I just ask the question, if people are given a free choice in it, you rarely, if ever, have seen them voluntarily adopting to live under a command economy, a socialist system, and the political environment that has gone along with it traditionally under the communist rule.
I just don't see a very grim, what do you mean by very grim conditions? I've been to the Soviet Union, I see people with apartments, they own cars, they have TV sets, their kids go to the university free if they're capable, and I mean, there are real problems, I'm not denying that, but the picture you're painting is of I don't know, Bangladesh or something, that these people are all just about... It is Bangladesh.
For a military superpower to be a third world backward country where you have people spending... How many hours does the average Soviet citizen spend trying to buy the basic staples of life? You may not regard that as grim, my friend, but I think that's a dismal environment.
No, the basic staples...
They do too.
No, the basic staples are very cheap. Bread is subsidized. Bread is still the same price it was in 1928. Transportation is still 7 kopecks on the subway. The basic staples are cheap. What's expensive are the luxury items like washing machines and cars and things of that sort.
Look, sugar is rationed. Gasoline is rationed. These are basic
I wish gasoline were rationed in this country. It might help our pollution situation.
Socialism may be your view of the solution to our problems too. It certainly is not the view of how you fix the problems.
No, but how many work hours does the American worker work to pay his rent or for his home or to pay his kids' tuition? You see, it depends on what commodities you set up to determine how well people are. There's no comparison. American workers have it over everybody else in the world if you measure it by power lawnmowers and by gadgets and home accessories and that stuff. But if you measure certain other things, we don't have it. We don't even have it that well compared to social democratic capitalist countries in Western Europe, where they got us beat in maternity benefits, vacation benefits, unemployment benefits, whatever else. So I don't think it's that simple, that's all.
Well, let's sort this out a bit. We're not necessarily talking about the power mowers and those types of things. Let's talk about 16,000 people in a week have emigrated, refugees, I suppose is the status that's more accurate, from the Eastern Bloc into West Germany.
Right, and look at those refugees. Compare them to refugees from Guatemala who come out half-starved, or refugees from Bangladesh. Look at them. They have these beautiful sweaters on, well-fed. Their kids have clear eyes and clear skin. I mean, the conditions of these people are fine.
The point is well taken.
These are the people who are fleeing the system. Those are presumably the people who are the most privileged of the society.
They're not the most privileged of fleeing.
They are about as privileged
professionals
as
are
you
not
get.
fleeing. Who are fleeing are gas station attendants, masons, skilled workers, electricians, plumbers, daycare attendants. I saw a breakdown on some of their jobs, and they're hoping they want to get something better. A lot of them want to travel. You see, you can't travel from East Germany. It's not the restriction. Generally, if you apply for travel from East Germany, you got a 50% chance of going, or up to a 90% chance. It depends on what occupation. If you're a nuclear physicist, you got maybe a 5% chance. Okay, but the restriction is on hard currency. There happens to be a monetary boycott against all socialist countries. Their currency is not accepted for exchange. Even though the East German currency is backed in terms of export power, it's certainly as strong as Mexico's or Spain's or Indonesia's, and we will accept those currencies, but we don't accept the East German Deutschmark. That means when you leave, you can only leave with about $10 or something, and so you're restricted to go either to Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Eastern countries which will accept the East German currency, or you go to West Germany if you have a relative who will put you up. And a lot of people are frustrated because they can't travel, including, by the way, a lot of doctors. And there you do have a point. There are lots of privileged professionals who have money, who have apartments, have cars and all that, but they now want something more, and they want to go more. If we accepted the East German currency, there'd be a lot more traveling. They're willing to let people travel, and most of them, 95% of them, come back, usually, except for this recent exodus.
Well, I think that's a gross misrepresentation. You have in the East Germany, as well as in other countries like the Soviet Union, profound restrictions on travel, and they do in part have a problem of how they're going to pay for it. But beyond that, they don't get the opportunity to wrestle with that problem, to try to figure out how they will translate their millions of kopecks or rubles into actual spendable currencies, because their government won't let them out.
Frank,
that is changing in some of these countries, and I think that's to be welcomed. In other of the countries, it's not.
Your anti-communist ideology is beginning to sound a little obsolete, you know? I mean, the events are moving very fast. You better start updating some of your anti-communist ideology.
I think keeping reality in perspective is the name of
They're letting any Soviet Jew out who wants to go now, and the U.S. won't take them in. So what are you talking about? They're restricting and holding them back.
That's a
why is that?
A fraction
because
of the population that is trying to get out of the Soviet Union.
Because this government never in its life cared about Soviet Jews. What they cared about was using that issue to bash Moscow over the head with it. And now when the Soviets say, okay, any Soviet Jew who wants to go can go, and not just to Israel, you want to go to the U.S., go to the U.S., and Bush says, oh, we can only take 50,000 of them.
Well, I fundamentally reject the argument that it has never cared about them. I can't agree with you
we just
more
had a sudden change of heart.
We're making a serious mistake.
Issue.
Gentlemen,
blocking these emigres and others from
Mr.
coming
Gaffney,
to our
excuse
shore.
me. Gentlemen, this is very interesting, and we will continue, but we will get the students involved. But one question I need to ask you is, I'm sure there are viewers watching this program right now who just don't get it, and their thought is, we're talking about travel restrictions. We're talking about people who want to be tourists around the globe, and those people are probably thinking, Mr. Parenti, there are other reasons that there have been human rights violations that those who have left the Soviet Union and the East Bloc have talked about that have encouraged them to leave. Seems that this discussion is sounding a bit insensitive to that. Can you comment on that?
No, I think people were restricted from leaving because conditions in the eastern countries after the war, in East Germany, was not as good as West Germany. East Germany had gotten most of the bombing, most of the destruction. Most of the industry was in West Germany. West Germany got a lot of aid from the West, and what the Soviets did, they started taking stuff out of East Germany. So you had an awful lot, and you also had a lot of Nazi collaborators and other people who didn't have much future in East Germany who were still in East Germany. So there's a lot of people who wanted to get out of East Germany and go west. And the East Germans did build that wall and did put those restrictions because they saw their economy at stake, that if these people just all went, that could just clean them out. That's true. I don't believe, I think as of today, though, that situation is not, that image, which I think you're still holding to very, very lovingly, that image has changed. And there are a lot of people who travel out of the Soviet Union, who travel out of Eastern Europe, and who go back.
So you're saying that those practices that led to Ronald Reagan not long ago referring to the Soviet Union as the evil empire, that's in the past?
I think most of that's changing. And my authority is Ronald Reagan.
Changing or changed?
Changed. Well, my authority is Ronald Reagan himself in Moscow. He said, well, that image of the evil empire is over. It's
John,
past.
You think that the evil empire moniker still has some application?
Well, the thing that made it an evil empire was partly the repression that it exercised of its people. And notwithstanding what's been described as anti-communist rhetoric, it's the fact that people still do not enjoy the right to leave the Soviet Union either for temporary purposes or for permanent emigration at will. They do not. That is a right that is not available to people by and large throughout the Eastern Bloc. The reason that we have as a government attached so much importance, it is. The reason we've attached so much importance to that as a government historically has been it's the most fundamental right. If the system cannot be fixed, if the system is repressive, if the system denies you your human rights, you have, in the final analysis, last recourse, the right to leave. We should continue to attach importance to that. Now, the other aspect of the evil empire that has not changed is the continuing capability of the Soviet Union to threaten massively our security and the security of our allies. I welcome changes in that. I'm more than happy to acknowledge them where they occur, but even Les Aspin and members of Congress who were delighted to extol these changes and have had hearing after hearing with Soviet representatives to applaud them for their changes, have acknowledged on the basis of a recent visit to the Soviet Union that much of this is not, in fact, resulting in fundamental changes, massive reductions.
What is this fundamental? You see, fundamental is an infinite regress. Any change that's happened, but that's not a fundamental change. That's not, and it won't be fundamental until you get capitalism in the Soviet Union, and until you get a multi-party system, and that's what he wants, until you get rich and poor again, until you get people with private markets making their money. As far as the military changes, those have been dramatic, and it's not the Soviet Union that's holding up on further disarmament proposals. Shevardnadze made that point. When is the State Department, when is Mr. Bush going to come along? I mean, that disarmament is a two-way street. They have the capability to destroy us, and we have the capability to destroy them, and they have been eagerly putting everything on the table, ready to negotiate long-range nuclear missiles, cruise missiles, submarine missiles, everything. And in fact, even when we don't negotiate, they've been doing unilateral cuts.
Gentlemen, we're all over the map, and so we're going to try to get this focus back with the students. But the freedom of movement issue that Mr. Gaffney raised, that's not part of the system you'd like to maintain. I don't think that's a fundamental right. I think the fundamental right is to be able to eat, to be able to see your kids not cry with hunger, to be able to educate them, to be able to have a decent life. So if there's food on the table, you won't mind that movement is restricted?
I think the first right is food on the table right. In our country, we have 34 million people living below the poverty level. When Ronald Reagan came into office, it was about 23 million. The poor have been the fastest growing group in America, and of that 34 million, you've got about 10 or 12 million who today don't get quite enough to eat, who are suffering conditions of malnutrition, according to joint congressional committees that have studied this. I think that's a fundamental right. I think that's a failure of this system. Why don't we talk about some of those failures once in a while in the media?
Let's go back to Fairfield, California, and you can help us. I know we want to get you more involved in this discussion than you have been up to now. Help us by asking specific questions and by directing them to either Mr. Gaffney or Mr. Parenti, and then we promise that we will be shorter with our answers. Go ahead, please.
Hello, my name's Jason. I'm a guest from Sacramento, California.
Hi, Jason.
And my question is directed to Mr. Parenti. What is Gorbachev's ultimate goal for Eastern Europe now that he has broken the Brezhnev Doctrine by allowing the changes in Poland and Hungary to take place?
I think he hopes that they will move toward a more open, more democratic, and a more productive socialism, but I think he would still want them to be socialist. I don't think he's prepared to use force against any of the Eastern European countries if, in fact, they pursue other foreign policies. And it's not a speculation on my part, that's an absolute fact. Let me give you the case of Romania. Romania has again and again taken a course contrary to what Moscow wanted even before Gorbachev with Brezhnev, and Moscow has still maintained rather congenial relations with Romania. And so I think there's the so-called bloc, this coerced bloc. That's another mythology about this bloc that will always be coerced and held on these enslaved chains. I don't see that anymore. I think there's probably, I mean, I don't really see Hungary getting the kind of pressure applied to them from Moscow that I saw West Germany get from Bush and the U.S. when Kohl suggested he didn't want the short-range missiles. I mean, the pressure, the media hype on that, the issue, how we get our Western allies to understand that they've got to think exactly as we do on this, and and even some of the threats about trade and whatever else, the pressure on New Zealand when they said, we don't want any U.S. ships here because you got nuclear weapons on them and you won't tell us which ones have nuclear weapons and which don't, so we won't take them in. I mean, the threats of New Zealand about we won't import your lamb anymore, we won't do, when if that sort of strong-arm stuff happens, if Moscow did that to one of its allies, we'd say, look at this communist evil empire at work pressuring them.
This is positively absurd.
I think
we've got a situation in which Soviet troops are in occupation of these countries,